for today's session is obviously to provide you with some insights in terms of how you can boost your own well-being, but using that understanding, applying that also to your workforce. My goal is to work through over the next 20 minutes, share some of the key insights that we've had working with a range of different organisations, some of them as small as 3 employees up to as high as 50,000 and everything in between, across a whole range of different types of industries. We've learned some things along the way, and really for me, what I want to share today is perhaps a different way for you to consider in terms of how to boost your own well-being, but how you can obviously enhance that with your teams as well. We will be moving relatively quickly through the content, but please ensure that if you do have a question, put it in that chat functionality and in the Q&A. That will allow us to kind of work through those questions and answer as many as we obviously possibly can. In terms of, I guess, our current reality, as was highlighted, we are facing that constant change. And we used to talk about a few years back, talking about how new change is the new status quo. Well, in fact, over the last 18 months or so, it's never been more so. And that's putting a huge demand on ourselves as individuals, as leaders, but equally so on our people. And what we've learned is that it's incredibly challenging to turn around to owner operators or leaders and say, not only are you responsible for keeping your businesses operating, but you're responsible for your own well-being, but also the well-being of those people working around you. As you'll know, mental health is a very complex area. Obviously, people respond in different ways, and it's about understanding how people respond and obviously providing some strategies in order to do that. But central to that is actually empowering our people to take ownership of their own well-being. And that is central to what I'm going to talk about today, is how do we ensure people are taking ownership over their own well-being, and what's the framework in order to help us achieve that? I find that in this space, unfortunately, I think in a lot of situations, we're putting huge long lists of strategies that people should be doing, and they are not always right for the individual. And of course, that is just another demand placed upon them. My goal today is not just to tell you 5 things to do that's going to transform your workplaces. My goal is to give you the framework that essentially we've learned that works to empower your people to take ownership. I think ASB's got some fantastic vision and insight here on the basis that not only are we running the session for you as owner operators or as leaders, but next week we're running a session for your employees as well. And that is to help take some of that load off you to deliver some of the messages that we're going through today, to deliver them directly to employees. And the goal being that obviously they can get those key insights, they can take more ownership and be empowered to manage their own personal well-being. So obviously that's next week's session. We'll talk more about that at the end. So let's get underway. Firstly, because we're in this environment where there's so many external factors and we're constantly hearing in the media all of these variables, we often find ourselves looking externally and consistently looking externally. We're finding ourselves dialing in at 1 o'clock to check those numbers, seeing where they sit. What does that mean for our environment? But unfortunately, in a lot of scenarios, we're actually not spending the time reflecting on the impact that it's actually having on us as individuals. And I often highlight what the impact would be is if at 1 o'clock we all took half an hour out of our day and focused on ourselves and how we were responding and what we could be doing better to promote our own mental health and well-being. I'm sure that would be a better return on investment in terms of time. So it's important to consider that. We also know that based upon that severity of that stress response, it's due to these 2 variables. The first one being those sources of stress, and the second one being the person side of the equation. That interaction determines the severity of that stress response. In my experience, those people that tend to be most vulnerable are those people that tend to focus only on the left-hand side of that equation, our sources of stress. And what we know at the moment is we haven't got a lot of control over those sources of stress, which can leave us vulnerable. So today is very much focusing on the right-hand side of that equation to minimise the severity of that stress response. So we're focusing on that right-hand side of the equation. When we don't, we are vulnerable to experiencing some of those negative indicators of stress. And I think it's worthwhile just looking at that sequential nature that people tend to work through as those stress symptoms increase. and we go through different phases. We tend to show different indicators, but we go through these common stages. And as you can see, the alarm, stress, arousal, energy conservation, and exhaustion, they're quite different on the basis of the indicators that we do experience. As you work your way through that list, you'll notice that the indicators become a lot more severe. What we often find, and think about your own personal situation, but what we find is that ultimately most people don't recognize there's a problem until they get to that energy conservation phase. And often that's when we tell them they should be exercising, they should be talking to someone. But in a lot of cases, we're pulling away from people. Our energy levels are down. So it's important we recognize what those early indicators are for us as individuals and what strategies are uniquely going to work for us. And that's an important statement. What strategies are going to uniquely work for us? And that's what our focus will be on moving forward. But as a first tip, I'd encourage you to get familiar with your indicators. The sooner you recognize an indicator, the sooner you can put a strategy in place, the more effective it's actually going to be. We need to treat it as feedback that something has to change. And if we don't change something, we're vulnerable to experiencing those obviously further exacerbated indicators. Now, the work that we do, we tend to centralize our work around what we call our 10 healthy habits. As you can see on screen, for those of you that are paying attention, you'll see there's only 9. There's a reason for that. We are going to be focusing on the final healthy habit, which is actually engage yourself. And in my experience over the last 18 months, this has the single biggest impact in terms of promoting people's well-being. It has the single biggest impact on promoting their mental health, but it's often something that we don't talk about or don't have the clarity on that I believe we need to, particularly in this changing environment. So let's focus on engage yourself as a healthy habit. And really our engage yourself healthy habit is underpinned by our personal values. Now, we all know that we've had different experiences in life, which has shaped our personal values. We've all had different experiences, so we all have different personal values. Now, these values influence our decision-making. So every day we're making these decisions that are influenced by those values. Not only that, but when we get the option between A and B, we're more likely to choose whichever gives us the higher degree of value fulfillment. We know when we're operating in an environment that promotes those values, we are more resilient, we are more engaged, and we're more motivated. And we can certainly cope with a changing environment. Now, obviously, those values influence the behaviours that we display, and then ultimately our overall well-being. Now, most people, and it's a question that I'd ask you now, is do you know what your personal values are? And I'm hoping many of you will say, well, yeah, and most people say, yeah, I kind of know what they are. The goal that we have in terms of the work that we do with our clients, and one that we want you to seriously consider, is do you know your personal values well enough to strategically design your week? And that's a big difference from intuitively knowing what your values are. Do you know your values well enough to know what specifically happens during the week that directly promotes what is uniquely important to you? Because based upon that, we can design a strategy that is more likely to provide you the return on the energy you invest in that strategy. In my experience, I've seen and come across a number of people that have put in place commonly believed mental health strategies that compromise their personal values, which essentially leave them more vulnerable or exacerbating those stress indicators. So it's really important we know what those values are. When we don't, we're more vulnerable to being like an onion. And as you can see, this is an onion on screen. It doesn't quite look like an onion, but it is an onion. You understand the concept in a moment. Is where those personal values, when they're compromised, we tend to kind of build layers over that. And we're more likely to start looking at things that potentially are causing that stress. And of course, when we start trying to identify those things, we'll always find them. As we experience those negative indicators of stress, we're more likely to look for reasons as to why we're feeling that way. And then as leaders or managers, we'll often get people coming to us where they're highlighting these surface-related issues that have nothing to do with what's going on at the core. And as managers and leaders, we can often find ourselves trying to deal with all the surface-related stuff, but never really getting to what the key issue is. And our goal is to empower our people to know what the core issue is, so we are better equipped to put a strategy in place that's likely to have a bigger impact. And let's take some examples of that. So let's say we've got someone that values control. In a COVID environment under level 4, I suspect they're struggling somewhat. Or someone that values security and they're unsure in terms of their security of their organisation, or they've got financial challenges. I'm sure that they would be absolutely finding this incredibly challenging. Not only that, but what about someone who values recognition, and when they're working in the office, they get fantastic feedback from their manager, and then working from home remotely, they're not getting that same degree of recognition. What is the impact on that person? So it's important to recognise, well, what are those key drivers and how are they being impacted by the environment we find ourselves operating in? Not only us as leaders, as individuals in terms of owner-operators, but equally so, we want our people to have clarity around that. We want our people to have clarity around that. Why? Because our journey is different. Everybody's got a unique set of values and they're going to be impacted in different ways depending on the environment we find ourselves operating in. Because there's ebbs and flows throughout the year, what are the strategies that are going to uniquely enhance that person's ability to promote those things that are important to them? We often talk about this bucket when we're fulfilling our values, that's topping that bucket up. Life being life, however, when we experience events that compromise those, it drains that bucket. Now, if there's more coming out than there is coming in, we're more vulnerable. We're more vulnerable to experience those negative indicators. It's more likely to have a negative impact on our mental health and well-being. So we want to empower our people to ensure there's enough going in. And that is, again, going to be unique for each person. And that is why, again, we're running the session next week to provide that framework for your people so they can start taking ownership in the ways that is unique to them. In terms of how they can do that, well, it turns out to be it's relatively simple. What we've learned is that a values-based strategy can have a huge impact on people. When we're struggling, when we're busy, when we're tired, when we're low on energy, a values-based strategy gives us the best return on that investment. It gives us that best return in making and topping up that bucket. And it's not about completely solving the challenges around us. It's about focusing on the things that are meaningful to us as individuals. And often it doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be values-based. And again, in my experience, I think in this industry, we've got a number of people that have challenges. We have a number of strategies that are getting promoted to promote mental health and well-being, but we need to get better at aligning those two things. And that needs to start with individuals taking accountability and responsibility for that. So in terms of a couple of leader tips that I just kind of wanted to share based upon that philosophy. Well, firstly, you need to lock in your wellbeing plan. That's critical. Willpower alone will not work. And because of the longevity of COVID, and we know it's not going to end quickly, is that we need to invest in our own well-being. And that starts with you recognizing what your personal values are and how well your environment is promoting those values, getting clarity around that and being proactive. Understand people will respond differently based upon what their personal values are. Reinforce what's actually they've got control over. You know, thinking about our sources of stress in the person, making sure that actually we're focusing on the things that they actually have control over. Reinforce what's not changing. There's so much focus on what is changing, reinforce what's not changing, because it enables us to get clarity about how we're promoting those key values. Often change requires us to find new ways to achieve value fulfillment. So by reinforcing what's not changing, we're more likely to anchor that. Bring people together to plan, to execute. That gives them more of an opportunity to create that environment that is uniquely important to them. Make time for questions so they get clarity about what those changes mean for them at a personal level. And then obviously be an example. And yes, I have reinforced again, lock in your own wellbeing plan. What does that look like? Well, that's based upon what those key drivers, those key values are. But we would hope that based upon understanding that, you can say what's going to occur this week that ultimately directly promotes what your personal values are. And that's, again, a key focus for next week's session. In terms of, I guess, I know this becomes a real challenge for some people, and it's, when we identify as leaders that someone may be struggling. So we've kind of included this framework to make sure that it enables you to kind of step through this process to understand, well, okay, what is the best way, should you identify that someone may be having some challenges within your team? And we are going to provide this to you, obviously, but essentially those first phases, that talk and listen, we've got some sample questions that you can actually use. How are you doing? How's life? How's the family? Mentioning the differences that you actually may see in them, to showing that level of understanding, and not judging them. Again, we all have those unique values. It's important to recognise ultimately that people are going to respond differently, and just because perhaps you're doing okay, that perhaps other people may not be. So we've got some template questions that you could actually ask, and some guidelines for that. Now, your goal is not necessarily to solve their problems. It's important to understand that. And I know many leaders and senior managers get caught in this sense of the difference between being a counsellor and a manager. The goal is to refer and support as much as you can. And there's obviously highlighting some indications of where people can access that professional support. And finally, following up and checking in with them. So again, we'll provide this model for you just so that you have that as a bit of a template that potentially you could use should you identify someone within your team needing perhaps a little bit more support. The other thing I just wanted to quickly finalise is really about the sort of longer term approach to wellbeing. And a lot of the work that we do is mapping out calendars for organisations and helping them implement these calendars. And you can see a sample calendar here. We'd always encourage organisations to look longer term in their wellbeing initiatives. But importantly is that they're underpinned by a behaviour change cycle, which includes those 4 key areas: awareness, education, motivation, and reward. In our experience, often when one of those layers are missing, it compromises outcomes. So we will make this template available to you. And if you're thinking about any type of initiative, just identify where it sits on those 4 key levels and try to implement a solution that essentially goes across each of those 4 key levels. So we will absolutely make that available to you. Finally, in terms of a couple of program tips, if you like, senior leadership support is critical for any wellbeing initiative. So as leaders, demonstrate that obviously your willingness to participate, to engage, the value you see in those initiatives across your organisation. Show some presence, ensure that you're talking about it as much as you can. It's a key factor in the success of any wellbeing initiative. Map your program out at least 6 months, aim for 12. That stops that ad hoc kind of decision making, but map it out as much as you can. Ensure that it's underpinned by that behaviour change framework. Encourage family participation where possible. So we've been delivering a lot of webinars, as you can appreciate, on how to cope with change, build resilience, identify values, all of these types of topics. But it allows family members to participate alongside people. It's a great way to increase that degree of engagement and obviously reinforce the value across an organisation. And also, when you've got perhaps larger teams, focus your energies on those cultural icons. Who are your cultural icons? Those people that have a bigger influence across the team's beliefs, views, and so on. Get those people on board, focus on them, and it's more likely to spread those benefits across the team. Just on the tools front, we will make available to you through ASB's Hub. We will make that available in terms of some wellbeing tips paper that you can think of from an organisation perspective. It's a bit of a white paper. We'll make that available to you. Equally so, we will make that template calendar available. We will also make available a link where you yourself and also your employees can do a free wellbeing assessment to highlight potentially where they can invest some energy and to promote that overall wellbeing. And equally so, we also can provide you, if you have interest in that, in terms of a digital wellbeing platform that obviously can host a calendar like I previously showed across those 4 key layers. In a way that minimises admin and keeps it nice and simple and easy to implement. So we'll make obviously information about that available. The last thing is really just this session for next week. Now, the session for next week for your people, we'd encourage you to get as many of your team participating as possible. The focus of that is actually taking them through the process on how they can identify their personal values. It'll give them examples of strategies they can put in place. And a key outcome of that is people more likely to take ownership for their well-being. They're less likely to be like onions. They're more likely to focus on those core factors that are uniquely important to them, and hence more likely to obviously boost that well-being in times when our environment is constantly changing. So we would strongly encourage you to get your people along to that. It takes some of that pressure off you as a leader, as a manager, in terms of feeling you have to kind of manage their well-being. It's about passing on that ownership and empowering your people. So we would encourage that.